Hi there, welcome back to the channel and thank you very much for joining me. So today I want to talk about something a little bit different. We're going to do a little bit of a model review, but I wanted to give you a bit of a talk about a little bit of Formula One history that many people probably will only have a very sketchy knowledge of, if at all, and a Formula One car that a lot of people have never heard of. The car itself, we'll get into the detail of that later. I just want to start off by giving you a little bit of a background, and it's to do with this sort of golden era. I've mentioned it in one video in the past, the golden era of Formula One, I think I called it. And it's this era of when the sort of new thinking in terms of aerodynamics came into Formula One in the late 1970s, and leads to some very, very dramatic times in F1 in terms of radical changes in design. So let's talk about this for starters. First of all, I want to talk about the sort of very potted, in a couple of sentences, history of Formula One. Basically, Formula One really started in the sort of 1920s, 30s when they started racing cars on a regular basis in places like France and the UK, and it spread across Europe and around the world. But the cars used to have their engines at the front with the gearbox usually at the sort of the back, and the driver would sit in the middle, and he'd have a huge great fuel tank right in front and right behind him quite often. And these were these very sit up and beg, quite dangerous cars, let's be honest. They were just dreadful things. They were very heavy, they were tall, they had everything going against them really. And then in the 1950s things started to change and they become slimmer, and then there was some innovation started to creep in. And they became lower, and you remember these sleek red Ferraris that were very dominant at the time of Grand Prix, when Formula One itself was actually born as a championship in 1949, my memory's going, 1949, I think it started at Silverstone, didn't it? And 1949, 1950, because they just had the anniversary, didn't they, 70th anniversary, it was 1950, Silverstone. So, shortly after then, design started to, we got more modern technology after the Second World War, and things started to pick up a bit of a pace. And when we got toward the end of the 50s, a man came along who was, frankly, a genius of a designer. And this man was called Colin Chapman, a Londoner, a man who started life as a garage mechanic. Interestingly, so did Ron Dennis, by the way, but I digress. It's interesting they have similar backgrounds. And he became this preeminent force in Formula One because this guy was very, very clever, very scientific, very keen to try new things. And soon he basically bought his own company, set up in London, and eventually moved out to Norwich. Later, that was, but they started innovating. They actually built some road cars as well. The Lotus 7 was first proper sort of racing car for the road, you might say. Open top, lethal thing, but very, very sporting, great fun. And then he started developing his Formula One technology. And the first thing he did was he took the concept of moving the radiators from the front of the car, and in trying to help the balance, he wanted to move the radiators and he wanted to move the engine. And he did two great innovations. The first one was he bolted the engine to the actual chassis as a structural chassis member behind the driver's head instead of having it in front. So this instantly gave the car better traction because it had a lot of the weight at the back. He then, of course, wanted to move the radiators as well from the front to the centre of the car and create these side pods, which is basically a concept we still have today. So again, all the weight was going more centrally into the car and the drive at the rear, but in this time, less complications, short drive shafts, a much lower centre of gravity and better handling as a result. Excuse me. So, already Chapman, by the early mid-60s, Chapman was already way ahead and regarded as a bit of a thorn in the side of the big Italian teams like Alfa Romeo and Ferrari, and I think that Mr. Ferrari was no fan of Chapman. He used to call him a garagist, sort of a hobbyist mechanic sort of attitude, you know, a bit of it inferior. And whereas Chapman was using engines that used things like Cooper Climax engines, and later he used the Ford DFV Cosworth engine. Obviously Ferrari made his own cars and his own engines, and his answer to everything was horsepower. So these two men had completely different approaches to their on-track confrontations with their vehicles in the racing world. But then Chapman moved on and then started to really, I think he realised there's only so much you could do in terms of having now got the major change of the engine behind. Ferrari didn't do this for a couple of years and had to follow in the end because You know, in the days of, was it 62, 63 when Stirling Moss was in the Lotus and absolutely dominated at Monaco, and it just wiped the floor with the Ferraris. I think he lapped them. He was certainly very dominant in that race anyway. I think that was Lotus 49, I think. Forgive me if I'm getting these numbers wrong, I'm just working off memory. Anyway, Ferrari had to follow suit, and then Chapman sort of ran out of sort of mileage in terms of what he could do with engines and things and radiators. He'd already got that. Now next he turned his attention to aerodynamics, and this is really where his genius came onto another level compared to anybody else that had gone before, or really since, with perhaps with the exception of Adrian Newey. Anyway, what he did was he developed wing technology, and he started mounting wings on the cars. He also had his cars the first with sponsorship, company sponsorships on, and things like Gold Leaf, you know, and then John Player Special and all this kind of thing, and Valvoline, Goodyear, and he was getting paid and actually becoming a commercial operation. So that was another innovation for Lotus. But then they started with these wings, and they started to have more and more elaborate wings, wings on the front, wings on the back, and then I think it was in 1971, I think at Montjuic at the Spanish Grand Prix, Barcelona, then things really started to get out of hand. This is where they have these, you may have seen photographs where they have these wings but on these enormous stalks that are literally about 1.5 to 2 meters in height, above the height of the car. And of course these were on very flimsy aluminium stays, and they broke, and Jochen Rindt broke, and he was hurt, not badly luckily, but he smashed his nose, and some awful pictures on the internet of them getting him out of the car. Graham Hill's car, the exact same thing happened, but he didn't have such a big accident. He just creamed it into the barriers and jumped out. But Jochen Rindt really hurt himself. He smashed his face, there was blood pouring out, some horrible images. He was okay. Sadly, we know that he later died. So was that 70s? He died in 70, didn't he? So I think this must have been in the spring of 70. And of course he actually did die in Lotus 72 in Monza, in qualifying at Monza. But that's another story. There was this feeling though, I mean, I've alluded to the accidents, there was this feeling that Chapman's cars were a little bit flimsy, and he always used to say, you know, if you want more performance, add lightness. And everything would be just on the right side of braking. And he did, of course, have all sorts of drivers getting killed in his cars. And I mentioned Jochen Rindt was perhaps the most famous, because he was then awarded the Formula 1 World Championship crown posthumously, having died in qualifying at Monza. He still had more points at the end of the season than anybody else. The one and only posthumous Formula 1 World Champion, which is very sad, isn't it? Anyway, we're not going to dwell on the negatives. Chapman's genius was just trying to get this fine line between success and disaster, and he moved on. I think he realised this. Losing Jochen Rindt hurt him very deeply, and he then turned to drivers like Emerson Fittipaldi. He was very successful in his cars, and then when Fittipaldi left the team in the sort of mid-late 70s, he recruited a driver called Mario Andretti, the American from Nazareth in Pennsylvania, and a very successful partnership started for 3 or 4 years between them, at the very time when Chapman's peak in terms of innovation was coming to the fore. So what Chapman worked on then was he got the right driver, and he basically started developing with Peter Wright and Tony Rudd, who's his two top men in the team. They kind of accidentally discovered this principle whereby they were experimenting with the shape of the underside, of the side of the car, where they have these big side pods. And we've got the famous Lotus 79 right here, which we'll come to. In fact, I'll zoom you in as I'm talking, because I think you'll get more appreciation of what I'm talking about then. So we've got these side pods, which is quite a long part of the car, where it says Olympus here. If you look very carefully, you can see underneath where it says Olympus that the black, it's the John Player Special scheme, of course, but the black is matter near the bottom. Now this is the discovery that they made. They discovered that if they shaped this area underneath and made it swoop up at the back to the back of the car, like my finger's going here, it creates this massive diffuser effect. And you create, by having the shaping underneath go down and squeeze the air and then gradually let it escape by bringing it back up in shape, you create a low pressure area, it's a bit like an aeroplane wing but upside down. And I mentioned about this matte black area under where it says Olympus cameras. That is the crucial element that they sort of stumbled upon. That was that it was effective, but the air would just leak everywhere. But if they put this sort of what they call a sliding skirt that was spring loaded to seal the gap between the car and the track itself onto the tarmac, the air could not escape. And as soon as you got that situation where the air had only one choice, and that was to go through this Venturi tunnel, as they called it, under and up, you have this massive area of low pressure, and the faster the car goes around the corner, the more low pressure you get. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy sort of thing. It creates its own greater success. The more you push the car, the more downforce you get, and the faster you can go. Only limited by the grip of the tyres, of course. So, this was developed in a car called the Lotus 78. We have a photograph of it here. And it's a brilliant book actually by John Tippler about the two critical years of cars. The years are actually 77, 78, but they always had this thing where it was they were numbered one after the year that was currently being used. Here is the 78, and you can see on the 78 that the skirt I was talking about is here. But it only actually occupies about 2/3 of the side pod, and this is where they were experimenting back and forth, trying to decide exactly where to put the skirt in relation to the low pressure zone, where it bulges down here. So it does this basically, it bulges down then goes up gradually at the rear, and that's making the whole side pod a diffuser. It's basically what they call Venturi system, so you have a small entry and a massive exit which accelerates the air even more. So you can see if you look carefully, this skirt sort of starts just under the P, sort of between the S and the P of special. So it's not the full length, whereas on the 79 we've just seen it is the full length of the side pod. And this car was very successful in 78, but it wasn't quite developed, it wasn't quite ready. In April 79 at the Silverstone Daily Express TT race, Tourist Trophy race they called it, which is like a one-off for the Easter weekend thing they used to have. I barely remember this, but I do vaguely, but I remember that the race was pouring with rain. I think you can see there's a video on YouTube, excuse me, where there's teeming with rain, and the Lotus 79, I think he spins off in the end, but I mean everybody was spinning off. It was just ridiculous conditions. It was one of those late winter weekends, shall we say. So people didn't take this car that seriously. It was introduced, it was a good way of doing it really. And it didn't have that much success, but then it was a lottery race, so nobody took any notice, and then it rocked up, I think it was at the Belgian Grand Prix at Zolder a couple of weeks later, and bingo, this was the game changer. This car swept everything before it, won the race, and it went on to win most of the races that season, except one. A couple of months later in June, Gordon Murray rocks up with his answer to the Lotus 79. Now they had a completely different set of problems. They had lots of power, but they had a heavy and not particularly well handling car, driven by a genius in the shape of Niki Lauda and John Watson, another good driver from Northern Ireland. But they struggled with these cars, so he looked at the design and wanted to build a ground effect car, and in some respects couldn't, because they have this huge flat 12 boxer engine from Alfa Romeo, and it fills out the side of the car, so they haven't got this space that the narrow angle Ford V8 DFE had got, and allowing you to put these channels up the side. So he racks his brains, and he's in real trouble. Obviously they're getting trounced on the track, so he comes up with a different solution altogether. One might even say he was cheating, but that would probably be a little strong. He was very, very innovative, very like Chapman actually. In fact, I forgot to mention his name. He was the next one after Chapman, and then you have Adrian Newey. You have three outstanding geniuses in Formula One. Now this car, I'm just going to show you. This is the Brabham BT46B, and these cars faced off at the Swedish Grand Prix in June 1978. And of course this is the car we now know as the Brabham fan car, because of course it has, to quote Gordon Murray himself, he said, "I put a ruddy great fan at the back," and it was generating more than the car's weight in downforce. Now this got round the problems of not having self-propagating aerodynamic downforce, which is what the Lotus had, because it just basically acted like an enormous hoover and sucked the car down with tremendous force. He had to seal, if you look carefully, he had to seal off with skirts too around all round, even where the wheels are at the front there. So he's got skirts all the way around the side, and even at the back he had to seal the entire car to the ground so there was no air gaps. apart from the entry at the front where the air would rush in. So then it would just honker down onto the road and went like Billy-o. And this was driven directly, of course, as you can probably tell, driven off the gearbox. See where there's a little red light in the middle there. So this is really rather clever. And it caused a bit of a storm. This appeared, and it is quite obvious what was going on. I'm not sure people were that worried about it initially, because I think it was felt to be another wacky, bit of a crazy novelty really. But as soon as it went out on the track, it was dominant instantly, and it had even more grip than the Lotus 79. However, there's a couple of problems. One is reliability, whereas the Lotus 79 only relied on these sliding skirts, which were relatively reliable, pretty reliable. This didn't. This required on this mechanical fan, and if anything went wrong with the fan, it broke, or a blade broke, it would probably just explode the fan, and the driver would be going maybe 15 or 20% quicker in a corner, and could pitch him straight into a massive accident, you know, over which he would have no control and be going at such high speed. It was considered very dangerous. And in addition, it was spitting stones up, because it was hoovering up anything off the circuit, any dust or stones from a car that had been off. It would just hoover this up and then spit it backwards, you know, at about 300 miles an hour, quite literally. Quite dangerous if you're following in a car that's doing 180 yourself. And Mario Andretti complained, maybe disingenuously, but he complained it was like being shot at with bullets, you know. And it was felt that this is probably not the way forward, because every other team would have to copy this very expensive technology, and they didn't want to do that. So, predictably, Niki Lauda won the Grand Prix in Sweden at Anderstorp. It made this car instantly victorious on its first race. Very unusual situation. Even the only kind of matching with the Lotus 79, but it didn't win its first race. It went to Silverstone and failed. But yeah, I think it was felt that this was just a step too far, and the other teams, including Frank Williams and Colin Chapman, said, look, to Bernie Ecclestone, who owned the Brabham team at the time, and later went on to run the whole of Formula 1, of course, and they ganged up on him and said, look, you know, Bernie, we're not going to join your Formula 1 Constructors Association, FOCA, that they were just in the process of forming. We're not going to join together. We're going to do our own thing, because this is a crazy idea, and you've got to stop it. And he decided that was actually more important than winning the race and the championship. So they took the race win, and then they just withdrew the car, much upsetting Gordon Murray, the designer. But anyway, we digress. So this is kind of setting the scene for you of some of the amazing innovations that were going on. I mean, two completely different solutions. One's kind of clever aerodynamics, and one's using brute force and a bit of aerodynamics as well. So I'm just going to bring that back, and we will talk about what happened in the next year or two, because this is quite germane to the story. So, let's bring you in a bit more. Here we go. There's that. So what happens is, Lotus win the championship with Mario Andretti. Sadly, Ronnie Peterson is actually killed his teammate. Ironically, in the 78 model, they have this pile-up at Monza, Italian Grand Prix in September 78. Peterson breaks both his legs and suffers an embolism after bone marrow contaminated his blood. It's a horrible story, you know, and he died the next day. So he wasn't. People think he was in the 79. So, it was a killer car. He was actually in the older 78, and he had quite a horrible accident into the guardrail, head on, you know. Big incident involving Riccardo Patrese and James Hunt and all sorts of people. But anyway, the next year, Lotus decide to go one step further, and I'm just going to get the book out, because there's some very interesting pictures here of the subsequent successor car, which is called, predictably, the Lotus 80. Now, the Lotus 80 takes things to a whole new level. With this car, Carlos Reutemann now joins Mario Andretti as his teammate. In this car, we have a much longer version of the Lotus 79 with this wingless design, where now we have skirts even along the nose, all up the side, a much longer car with a shaped body. So it has a shaped skirt instead of being straight, and this causes a lot of problems. Plus, they can't balance. They have terrible problems when every time they tested this car or tried to race it. They couldn't get the ability to tweak the handling. With a normal wing, you can make an adjustment up or down to balance the level of downforce between the front and the rear. They couldn't do that. So in the end, they withdrew it after several attempts with racing it. They withdrew it and went back to the 79 in the Martini colours, as you see there. The problem with that was, for whatever reason, they'd chosen to change the basic layout of the 79. It was famously mentioned about how well balanced it was and how, you know, it's beautiful design. But it has these inboard brakes either side of the gearbox, so your disc brakes and calipers are right next to the gearbox. Again, your unsprung weight is reduced because you've got this centre of gravity very low. You've pulled everything in close to the centre of the car. All you've got sticking out is the wheels, not even brakes. So this is a very, very good solution for maximum cornering power and lightweight handling, etc., and balance. But they didn't. They moved them in 1979. Chapman decided. I don't know the reason. I don't know if it actually tells me in this book, but I can't recall them ever quite clearly saying what the driver was. But they decided to move them out, as they are more traditionally, out into the hub of the wheel, the brakes. Now this made the car not terrible or anything, but it just took away a little bit of its performance, and suddenly, in the meantime, the others had caught up. Williams with their FW07. You now got Ferrari using a very wide-bodied car to try and have this room for the Venturi tunnels for ground effect. So they had a sort of a part ground effect car with a big flat 12 engine, lots of power and torque, which was very effective in '79 and won the championship, amazingly. It was the last time a non-ground effect, non-turbo car won the championship, until the rules changed many years later. But Lotus kind of lost the way a little bit. They spent so much money and time and effort into this Lotus 80, which just ruined the '79 season for them. In 1980 they came back a bit, but again things had moved on. You got Williams now became very dominant with their Frank Durney and Patrick Head designed FW07, very successful car, with a great driver in the shape of Alan Jones at the wheel, winning the championship in 1980. And you also had Brabham coming back. They'd now dumped the Alfa Romeo behemoth engine for the Cosworth DFE that the competitors like Lotus were using. And what this meant was that they then had a narrow angle, so they then had a true ground effect car, and they had a great driver in Nelson Piquet, who was then the new sort of hot young gun that was going to take on Jones, and did so, and won the title in '81 eventually. But that comes later. So this sets the scene for you. So what do Lotus do next? They've still got these innovative ideas around aerodynamics, but they abandon the Lotus 80. It's too big, it's too long, it's too complicated. Chapman comes up with something that sounds even more complicated, but actually is a brilliantly kind of simple and logical solution. The problem that they face, though, is that the head of the Automobile Federation that runs Formula 1, FISA, as it used to be called, Fédération Internationale Sportive Automobile, is headed by this man, I'm sure many of you will remember, a chap called Jean-Marie Balestre. Here he is. Now then, here's a character, if ever there was in Formula 1. This is the guy that many of you, if you don't remember him or you're too young or whatever, you may have seen him though in the Senna movie, because he's the one that's ranting and raving and laying the law down at the driver's briefing in the German Grand Prix in '91 at Hockenheim in that movie. And he famously, he's rowing with the drivers because they wanted, just for safety reasons, they wanted some cones moved at a chicane. And he famously says, and I never forget this, and even my wife laughs about it, he says, "The best decision," and he treats them all like schoolboys. He says, "The best decision is my decision." Huh? And he really did. And he had this way of winding people up. And of course he's almost famously linked with the rather controversial end to the 1989 World Championship, well, and 1990, but particularly the '89 Championship, when Senna and Prost collide at Suzuka, and then Senna pits to get a new nose and comes back from laps down and wins the race against all odds to keep his title hopes alive. And this guy has him black flagged, even though he didn't black flag other drivers for doing the same thing of missing the chicane when there'd been an incident. And he was basically, it was acknowledged later that people that were insiders said yes, he was trying to actively help Alain Prost to become '89 champion, which he did. So there was some real bad feeling, and of course Senna and him just didn't get on at all. Nigel Mansell was not a fan of his either. Anyway, this guy is important in the story that we're coming to, because he is not a fan of Colin Chapman either, and he's trying to help Ferrari and the French home team Renault, who developed the turbocharger in Formula 1 back in 1977 when it was introduced. They had developed their new turbo engine, and of course Ferrari kind of refined it. So as we get into 1980, to the start of 1981 season, you've got Ferrari and Renault with turbocharged engines. You've got Ligier, Matra and Alfa Romeo with big, huge sort of flat 12 engines. And this guy is kind of pulling the strings to try and load the odds in favour of these European teams. And he does this in a very dramatic way by announcing at the end, and it's not just him, but he's the driver. He announced at the end of the 1980 season, much to the consternation of all the sort of British teams like Lotus, Williams and Brabham, that they're going to ban the sliding skirts. Well, the sliding skirts is the only thing that makes the ground effect car absolutely work without danger. And the idea being that if they raise the skirts, in fact there was a programme on Horizon about this called Gentlemen Lift Your Skirts. And the idea was that it would have a 6 centimetre gap that was going to be checked by the FIA every time the cars came in the pits. And this would mean there'd be no more ground effect. So, Colin Chapman had a design, going back to him now, this is where things get very interesting. Chapman has a design called the Lotus 86 that he's secretly been working on with Tony Rudd and Peter Wright behind closed doors at Hethel in Norfolk. And what they've decided to do is to, initially it was going to have skirts. So this throws a massive spanner in the plans that they had for 1981. So what we learn is that they are going to get around this problem. And by the way, we have quite a good photo of Chapman here, which I should really show you. There's one here with Nigel Mansell. Here's Colin with Nigel. Very famous photograph. And of course he gave Mansell his debut in 1980 and then had him as one of his 2 young guns in 1981 with Elio De Angelis, 2 very talented drivers, although then Nigel was very inexperienced of course. Anyhow, what he's decided to do is come up with something completely revolutionary, which I'll have to show you, otherwise it may sound like it makes no sense at all. And what you have is a twin chassis car. The Lotus 86, which is then morphs into the Lotus 88. Now, this is very germane at the moment because it's exactly 40 years ago, right now, that this was going on. And what you have is you essentially have 3 major components to the car. You have the primary chassis, which contains the wheels. Ignore the wheels, I should say. Ignore the wheels that are in this and look at everything else. So the springing for the aerodynamics is what we're interested in, the barge boards and this framework. So effectively the aerodynamics here and the central bodywork here are totally separate. Ignore the wheels, and say pretend the wheels are not in that picture. These 2 components are completely separate to the rest of the car. Here is the rest of the car. So they actually call it the secondary chassis, but is almost like a traditional Formula 1 car of old, before they had bodywork. Here is the car in which the driver sits with its normal springs. The bit that provides the downforce, these 2 components, these are sprung with almost no movement. So they are going to be in contact with the track, or will ride up and down, forced down by the downforce. With the new regulations, the idea would be that this would sit down onto the track when it's going fast under load, thanks to the aerodynamic load and the soft or the ability for it to move up and down the way that they've sprung it. And when it slows down and comes into the pits, it'll rise up again, and therefore they will be within the regulations. So it's very clever, and it doesn't rely on any cheating, or it doesn't rely on any switches or pneumatics or anything being forced. It's just that the primary chassis will ride up and down due to the aerodynamic forces caused by the speed of the car. Now this is a brilliant, brilliant concept, and it is called the Lotus 88. So I'm just going to find you a good photograph. You bear with me 1 second, if we have one. I have one here. I've got better than that. Let's have a look what we've got here. We've got Colin Chapman. Here it is. So he says, here is the 88 indeed at Silverstone in the hands of Nigel Mansell, July 1981. So this is a very sleek looking machine. No front wings on it, although it did have front wings as an option. And you'll see different, that's De Angelis being refueled. Here it is, this is a later one actually, in recent years, historic racing. There's Mansell again. It's got this sort of a whale tail design. Beautiful thing really, very unusual design. And here we are, Mansell again at Silverstone in the pit lane. So in the pit lane, it sits with it's got like a rubbing strip underneath instead of a skirt. Sits completely legal. Then it goes out on the track. There's a gap, and then it goes out on the track, and it sinks down because of the pressure on it of all the aerodynamics. It's very, very clever. And here is the principle shown a different way. The three components, and that shows it in a much more easy to understand form. Actually, I should have shown that the first time. You see the bodywork at the top, the side panels and framework that suspends it in the middle, and then the actual car at the bottom. So the top two bits are the bits that ride up and down and give grip and downforce, and the car does what the car does, the normal things: braking, steering, accelerating, etc. It's pure genius. So, but there's a problem. This first turns up at the Long Beach Grand Prix in March 1981, and there's a great shock. It's then in the red, white and silver Essex colours, the Essex Petroleum Company, and they go out and start qualifying it, and they are about 15 minutes into qualifying, and they get black flagged on the FIA as saying, no, it's a movable aerodynamic device that you've got there, so that is against the rules. And Chapman says, but it isn't, it's a chassis. You can see it's sprung, and it's part of the actual construction of the car. It's not a separate aero piece moving on its own. It is a primary chassis, and he called it primary chassis, as you saw. No, you can't do that. So there's great anger then, because of course he's invested a lot of time and money in this project, and it's very clever as a solution. And that would have been a very nice, attractive sort of style of car if they'd all copied this design. It would have been quite easy on the eye. It's a very nice looking thing, I think, anyway. Anyway, it's they're told they cannot continue in the event with it. So De Angelis comes in, and there is again some footage on YouTube. You can see where he has to come in, and they make him jump out, and he jumps into the Lotus 81, which is now like 18 months, 2 years out of date, pretty much. And it doesn't go well for them. Anyway, Chapman speaks to the RAC Motorsports Association, and they assure him that, provided that he doesn't change it, that they believe it's within the rules. So months later, he arrives at the British Grand Prix, and this is where I come into the story, because I also arrive on the Saturday afternoon. Sorry, I lie, I actually turned up for the race day on Sunday. Myself and Chris Evans, the radio DJ, who was in my class at school. Yeah, we actually rode with another 5, 6, maybe 7 of us, with one of our woodwork teacher from our school in Warrington, and we all went down there in a minibus, would you believe? So this is, okay, I'm not name dropping, it's a fact, okay. So this is July, I think it's the 13th of July, I think it was, 1981. And we all go down there expecting to see the Lotus 88, and there's great anticipation. Everybody's very excited by all this hoo-ha and kerfuffle that's been going on about the 88. They all want to see it. And we get there, and well, hello. FISA stepped in on the Saturday afternoon when they were doing qualifying and said, no, this car is not legal, which was very, very, according to all the lawyers it was. This car is not legal, and they warned the RAC, who had accepted it and given it scrutineering pass. They get a sticker to say it's been approved for the rules and for safety, and it gets a scrutineer sticker, and it got these, and they had the proof. And they said, now, if you race this car, the British Grand Prix will lose its World Championship status, and there will be no British Grand Prix next year. So the RAC had no option but to tell Chapman, and he had to withdraw it. And Mansell and De Angelis jumped into the Lotus 81s, which, as I say, were out of date. And Mansell never qualified. So I never got to see Nigel Mansell in his first British Grand Prix, which really upset us all. Very, very disappointing. And it was really sad because this car... everybody says, I've seen several documentaries, you'll see them on YouTube, Autosport did one, say it wasn't very good, it was not developed though, it hadn't done hardly any testing, they didn't have time to test it properly. That car, had it been developed, I'm sure would have been a winner, because Chapman just did it every time. It just needed more development, that's all, and he was constantly thwarted with them changing the rules, moving the goalposts. Even Alan Jones, there's another movie you can watch called The Grid, which was narrated by Martin Jarvis, Rings on Their Fingers. He used to be in a sitcom, and he narrates it, and this is in 1981, at that very event, the British Grand Prix at Silverstone, 1981. And Alan Jones is also commenting, saying he feels that the FISA are fixing the rules against the interest of the garagist independent teams. Anyway, there we go. There's a little bit of a potted history for you. It was very sad because at the end of it, they say that this broke Colin Chapman. He then got into a lot of financial debt. Then he turned into this Delorean project. And a lot of people will tell you that Chapman was a crook and all this kind of thing. I don't really believe that. I think he was a very clever, astute businessman. He did get into a real pickle financially, you know. I mean, they were making some cars that were very, very popular. The Lotus Esprit was a great mid-engine sports car, and the others that they did. But he was just stretching himself too far with all this work that had gone in on this racing team. And of course, he had a heart attack in the following December '82. They did win again. They won in Austria. De Angelis managed to beat Rosberg by inches on the line at the Austrian Grand Prix in 1982 in August. And it was Chapman's last win, and he threw his cap in the air, which he always used to do when they won the Grand Prix. And it was one of the unique characteristics that people used to smile about, you know. But sadly, he had a heart attack just before Christmas in '82 and died. I think it was about, I think he was 58. He wasn't that old at all. Too young to have a heart attack. Anyway, that was it. It kind of broke him, you know. And there was talk that he was going to be indicted because of the Delorean scandal, and he got into a real mess. Getting involved with John Delorean was a mistake. There's no doubt about it. But we don't want to talk about that. Let's talk about this car, the 88, which we haven't really seen in any detail yet, except that we've got the Ebbro kit. And I'm going to do a quick review on it, if you don't mind, because any of you who love this era, this was probably the most exciting car that never raced. And this could have become a car that, you know, had the same sort of dominance you've seen from Mercedes in Formula 1 in recent years. This could have done the same thing if it had been developed properly. It was absolutely brilliant. Now here we have it. It's beautiful artwork with Nigel Mansell. So we're going to have a look at this, if you'll just bear with me. We'll move the earlier cars out of the way. And by the way, those of you that are interested, this is obviously the JPS Lotus, which is the Tamiya edition. And this is the Brabham fan car from Fujimi, and they're both in 20th scale. So I'll just move aside, and we'll get stuck into this quickly, because I told you a long story, I appreciate. On the side we've got beautiful artwork, and of course I mentioned the Essex Petroleum. Well, they sort of split the livery from this rather garish blue, red and silver, and they brought the sponsorship. Chapman loved this JPS black and gold, but he lost that sponsorship temporarily. He got it back the following year. But he went with the Courage Brewery, who are a Yorkshire-based beer brewer in the UK, and this was great because it's such a striking-looking scheme. I thought it was beautiful. Here you can see what it looks like. It does look odd without the front wings, but anyway. Blib blab on the side from our friends at Ebbro. In fact, the Ebbro, of course, it's MMP, isn't it? The actual name of the company. And then we've got a shot of the back. So let's have a look at the kit. You've probably forgotten by now. I've done so much talking. You're thinking, why did we get onto this? It's 40 years ago. So literally 40 years ago, this was under wraps and in secret development. And we kept reading little stories about it in the Autosport, and everybody's thinking, it was like, I mean, I was 15. And it was like the most exciting thing going on. It was like, oh, this secret weapon is being developed. It was going to sweep Formula 1 before it and, you know, humiliate the Ferraris and beat the Renaults. And they never gave it a chance, and it's such a shame. And let's have a look what we got in this box. Because this is a review we have not done before. Not opened the bags. And I'm going to build this one. Or should. Because it's like, kind of like the dream car in Formula 1, really. Let's see what we've got. Pop that over there. Now then. Well, first of all, we've got what look like little rivets. I don't know if you can catch that. Let's try and bring you in a bit and get my zoom to work. Oops, my zoom's been really hesitant. I don't know what's going on. I'm pressing it and it just suddenly stops for no reason. So here we go. These are like little silver rivets that go along the bodywork, self-adhesive ones. So I think if you're careful, that'll look quite good. Then we've got our Goodyear tyres, which are already pre-painted. Now that I love, because a lot of you that build these racing car kits will know. When you come on, Zoom, what's the matter with you today? I think the battery's going or something. When you do these, you normally get a decal, and it just doesn't last that long. After a couple of years, they start to flake off and crack. So they are pre-painted on both sides, so that's brilliant, really good for Ebbro. I've not made an Ebbro kit before, so it's new on me. Then we've got our decals. This I've got to see. This is another thing. That's how looking. I haven't opened this before, this is new to me completely. There's quite a lot of all sorts of things in here. All sorts of bits of tissue. Oops, didn't mean to do that really. Oh, look at that. That's very cool, isn't it? I'll bring you in. It'll make more sense, I think. There then. Look at that. It's like a number plate. I think the idea of this, if I remember, I think this is, it says Lotus 88B Courage, printed by Cartograph. These are going to be gorgeous, aren't they? Look at that. I think the idea of that is if you have a model of the Esprit, it's like a number plate size. I'm sure that doesn't go on this car, or does it? It might go across the front. So we've got lots of different. Oh, look at this! We've got seat belts in decal form. Generally, don't really like those, but they do look nice, don't they? But the trouble is, they always look a bit flat, don't they? 88 Essex. Then we've got. Oh, okay. They're sort of decals, but they are metallic decals. Look at this. Now, you've got a choice here. You could either spray aluminium, but it could be tricky. But it'd be tempting to go this route, wouldn't it? Really. That looks great. Put that over there. And then we've got the main decals. So we've got numbers here. Then we've got De Angelis. That's the Monaco flag, isn't it? I think he was a French, half Italian. I think he officially lived in Monaco. It's not the San Marino flag, is it? I'm just struggling to remember. See if it says anywhere. I'll come to that. I'll come to that in a minute. You've got the cockerel of the Courage Brewery here on your decals, and you've got your Courage, Tissot, more Essex logos, and number 11 here, Elio De Angelis, number 12, Nigel Mansell. You've got your instrumentation, you've got your little decals here for your seat belts, for the Willans belts. Lots and lots of little detail. Nice decals, and of course being Cartograph, they'll be absolutely fine. We're not going to have difficulties there, I don't think. I just need to rescue those bits of paper, so that they can be put on with tape, otherwise they're going to float all over the place later. Right, decals, there's lots of decals. Then we have, I won't take this one out of the bag I don't think, but it's basically the front windshield. Little windscreen that goes in front of the driver. It's better that way, isn't it? Nice, sort of a smoked effect. And you have your little cockerel of Courage Brewery on the front of that. Then we've got a host of your aluminium parts, and they've done these beautifully. Now, aluminium parts, chromed parts, I should say. I don't like them. I'm never a fan because they usually look. I don't know what it is in the process. I saw a review yesterday. Somebody was reviewing the Revell E-Type Jag, and they looked absolutely horrid, to be honest. These though are stunning because it's just flawless, and the Revell was anything but flawless. It was full of flaws. That's very, very nice. Look at the vents, the radiator. That's excellent. Those are nice. Then we have got our engine. Check this out. So I'm going to build this year. It's on my build list for the year. I always seem to say that, but I mean it this time because I have a connection with this car. Whoops. So this is your Ford DFV engine, and you can see what I was talking about. You can see the V here. Is it 56 degrees? I forget the exact spec. I think it's a narrow angle V relatively. So obviously at either side of this you had a nice big area where you can make your Venturis for your aerodynamics. You can see the oil pump and everything, it's all there, isn't it? Yeah, I'm not sure I care for the slightly toy-like look of the plastic, but anyway, it's quite good quality. It just looks a bit awful. And you've got your engine block at the end there, of course. Okay, so that back in there, and we've got some little poly caps. Put that back in there as well. Then we get into the meat of the actual car. And we've got the under chassis, the ground effect, the very heart of the ground effect is here. So bear with me 1 second. I'll just try and fight with the staples. They seem to have been to the Tamiya school of packaging for some reason. It's not good. For a resealable bag like we had on the decals. Now then, look at this. This is the heart of the Lotus 88. It's the underbody aerodynamics. And you can now see in profile exactly what I've been talking about. The shape of it, how the air comes in here, underneath gets squeezed and then is evacuated slowly. It opens up gradually, this venturi rear. That creates your low pressure air moving at very high speed out of this venturi and creating the downforce, and that's how it works. So that is, it looks long, doesn't it, actually? It's not as long as the Lotus 80 was. That was, they went a bit OTT with that. Such a shame you didn't get this 88 perhaps in earlier, but anyway. Then we have, a lot of sprues in this kit, I've got to say. Okay. Let's get this one undone. I'm going to bring it out a bit so you see what on earth's going on. There we go. Another staple to sort out. I do hate staples. The trouble is, if you miss them and you leave them in the bag, you end up scratching the model. If you rip it, you end up with a hole. I just did. Right, okay, here we are. Now then. Okay, so in actual fact, we've got the gearbox, we've got the bottom of the... they look the same, don't they? These two parts look the same. No, they're not quite the same. Different versions of the gearbox. I think that this one is a generic Cosworth DFE, I think. That's what it is. And on this one we've got some parts that are specific to this particular one. And the pumps are slightly different. That's what I recognise as being the same. Size of the gearbox here. I'll have to zoom in first. Let's just zoom in quickly. Here we go. Nice and fast zoom. So we've got the steering wheel and the pedals here. Gearbox sides. Both sides of the gearbox here. That's the bottom of the gearbox. And then we've got the... And this is another thing that's revolutionary about this car I forgot to mention, was that it was the first car ever. And here we have another slight controversy I should mention. The history books say that the first Formula 1 car to ever have a carbon fibre chassis was the McLaren MP41. But that's not true, because this was... it's true in terms of having raced, though, because they wouldn't let it race. This appeared at Long Beach before the McLaren was ready, about, I think, a month or 6 weeks earlier. It had carbon fibre and Kevlar tub, and they called it Chapman's tartan because it was such an unusual thing, and people were like, whoa, where's the aluminium bonded chassis gone? You know, it was all black and carbon weave. I have to say, this model would benefit from perhaps some of that carbon weave decals you can get. That would look really nice if you're going to open it up. However, it's, in some respects, it's a shame to open it up because then you lose the aerodynamics, which make it quite special and unique. But anyway, so this was the first ever Formula 1 car with a carbon chassis, but they never let it race. So it was this, not the McLaren that was actually first, but the McLaren was considered legal. So that went out of race, and that's why it has the official record. But make no mistake, this was out first, okay? So we've got your chassis, which you say is all carbon fibre. We've got your, I think the seat was carbon fibre as well. And then you've got your members and you've got your springs and all that kind of stuff. Lovely. So it's a beautiful sprue. It's got no flash on it. Looks nicer than Fujimi. You've got Ford moulded into your rocker covers here on your cylinder head. Got your members uprights for the suspension. Very nice. Pop that back in there. Oops. Another one that's gone missing. No, okay, forget it. Right, another 3 to go. Gosh. And then we'll get into the actual instructions. Now this is going to be nice. This is the body of it. Now, can I get in? Question. Let's have a look. Right. Ooh, this is nice. nice, this is nice. Now then, I think I better move that so you can see a bit better. Here we go. Look at this bodywork, it really looks beautiful. It's so swoopy, and the shapes are so pretty, isn't it? I mean, Formula 1 cars these days I think are as ugly as sin. And this is when they had a bit of style about them. Look at that. Yes. The rear wing here, underside of the rear wing on that side. Here's the front wing if you use it, because sometimes it was presented without the front wing. And these huge side pods, which is this, you know, swooping aerodynamic shape, like a whale tail style. And you've got your intakes here for your engine. You've got the top of the engine cover here for the trumpets, the intakes. And here's your other swooping, beautifully moulded side pod fence. So the parts on this sprue really are the parts, apart from the bits in the middle that's engine related. These are the parts that the aerodynamic clever part that ride up and down independently of the car, but create the downforce and give the car the speed through the corners. This is the sort of where the magic happens here on that sprue. And it is, I have to say, it looks completely flawless. That sprue is absolutely stunning. I don't know why there's a bit of a cutout in the design. Maybe that's, I don't know, it's a vent or something. Interesting that, I'm not quite sure what that's about. Then we have, and this might answer my question, this might be the other bit of bodywork on the piece there. I think that's definitely going to fit in that gap, isn't it? It's the right shape. Yeah, I think there's two different versions. I think it's an intake on the side pod. Then, last but not least, we've got, I won't bother opening this because I think it's going to be a bit samey, but it's basically the exhaust system and the suspension arms. So you've got your rear suspension there and your front here. And then we've got all the exhaust pipes here. And at this end you've got your drive shafts. There. Drive shafts inboard and outboard. And of course there's lots of springs and sort of rocker arms and things because of this very complex outer and inner chassis system. And then finally, like this one, again. Why have they put seal on for some reason? Two staples instead of one. Okay, we got it. Okay. Here we are. So, we've got the radiators, all the brakes, in the two sides, so there's an inner and outer face. Then we've got all the cooling system, lots of cooling pipes from the radiators. Then you've got all these intricate little springs and levers as part of this primary and secondary chassis suspension. Track rod, which is very long. And then you've got your instrumentation here. And then again at the top, yet more of this complex system of suspension arms and support rods that connect to the actual side pod, end plate of the side pod down the side. So there's an awful lot of parts and there's a lot of sprues, you know, for something that's relatively modest in size. Stick that back in the bag. It doesn't go in, does it? There we go. Right, now, finally, let's have a look at the instructions. Now, I've never built an Ebbro before. I'm told they're very good, so I'm not anticipating it's going to be a battle. I found Fujimi a little bit up and down, but anyway, let's have a look. So, starting with, just get rid of this backlighting. I'm not sure that's helping us at all. How's that? A little bit better, I think, there. So we've got the sprue map, so to speak. You can see there that you've got all the parts mapped out, and indeed I focused in on this. I noticed that there was a duplication on the oil scavenger pumps at the bottom of the engine, and sure enough they're greyed out. So obviously I was right that those are, it must just be a generic spring. Then here we've got the fantastic artwork for the 88, and this is showing it without any front wings on in this particular one. And it says 1981 British Grand Prix, Elio De Angelis, number 11, and number 12, Nigel Mansell. Nigel Ernest James Mansell, his full name's there. Cool. I'm sure he's impressed. Mansell, of course, was he actually broke his back about 18 months, 2 years before this, and he was in hospital for some time. There was talk he could have been a quadriplegic. He had a crash at Brands Hatch in his Unipark sponsored car. Mansell's profession then was, he was in fact, he was an apprentice at engineer at Lucas Aerospace. He became, of course, one of his sponsors. So he would have become an engineer by trade had he not become a racing driver. But I have to say, people knock Mansell a lot because of perhaps his demeanour, but I thought he was awesome. You know, I'd love to see him in this car at full chat. He was quick, Mansell, and he was very brave. He was one of the bravest of the brave. Well, it's a different era, isn't it? You know, I mean, these cars as well, especially in the mid 80s, when he was very successful and he joined Williams. Because Lotus, when Chapman died, of course, they never really got it together again until Peter Waugh took over in the mid 80s with the Honda engines, and Ayrton Senna came along, and things kind of clicked at the same time. But Mansell went off to Williams, of course. But in that era, that mid-late 80s era, the cars were very physical to drive, and people like Mansell did well because he was physically strong, you know. And the littler drivers like Piquet and Senna, sometimes in grueling races, especially street circuits, they used to struggle a bit because they weren't physically as strong, you know. But Mansell, I think, was one of the greats. I used to think he was very exciting to watch. So him and Senna, for me, were the two favourites of that era. Now then, let's get back in here, have a look at how we put this thing together. So you build up your Cosworth DFE engine, you get your V, and you get your cylinder heads in there, you've got your fuel injectors, quite a bit of wiring to be done here. Tension wire cord. Option for Japanese only. What does that mean? I'm not sure. Japanese use only. I'm not quite sure what that means. I presume there's some wiring in there that maybe I missed then, because I didn't see any wires, but we'll see. So you build up your engine, you pop your gearbox together here, then you've got your bracing struts across the top of the gearbox, then you build up your rear brakes and uprights, then you've got all your suspension, rear suspension around the gearbox to build, including your springs. Then you've got your drive shafts, which look quite intricate. They've got like a universal joint you need to build, which looks very cool. You've got your engine trumpets going in there, and then your drive shafts and your outer uprights and brakes going in, slotting into the gearbox. Then you build your exhausts up, pop them in. It's quite hard to know what to do with it. There we go. Then we're going to start building the front suspension arrangements and the front brakes and the calipers and the uprights going in. Then your suspension with your lower wishbones, and obviously your upper wishbones go in right at the beginning here, wishbone arms. Then you're going to build up your pedal area, seat, your track rod, steering rod I should say. You've got your brake, master cylinders here for the clutch and the brakes. In fact, there's 3 of them, so I'm not sure what the 3 are. Perhaps it's an additional one for this suspension system. It could be a reservoir for that. Then you've got your internals for your cockpit, you've got your steering wheel, and then you've got your fuel connectors that are going in behind the driver, which is basically from what would be the fuel cell here. That would be the fuel tank, that open space. And then you've got your connectors and your lower con rods and toe links and things for your suspension, plus, not forgetting here, your gear change. Then you move on to the bodywork, and we've got these huge great side panels for the aerodynamics for the primary chassis. It's interesting that he calls it the primary chassis, the aerodynamic vehicle. He calls the actual car the secondary chassis, which I found quite amusing. Typical of Chapman's thinking, really. So you've got your lovely swooping massive rear wing, you've got your Essex sponsorship going on there, then you've got your intake for your engine, you've got your trumpets cover here, and you then bring these in, slotting them through. And this is going to be quite tricky, I think, because there's lots of fine little parts for the framework for this. This is the secondary chassis, and this is the primary chassis. So that's got to all be brought together. I think you need to take your time on this, because I think it'll be quite confusing actually when you see it in the flesh. And then at the end, final stages, you build up your tyres and your wheels together. And I think those chromed ones will be absolutely fine, by the way. I think all you got to do is make them gold in the centre. Because they do have well, it says black in this one, black in the centre. Is that right? I'll check the photo. Anyway, and then you bring in this this sort of top, the aerodynamic cover for what they call the primary chassis comes down, and then obviously it doesn't mention anywhere putting those front wings on, but it comes with front wings, so that's a definite option. It shows it as wingless at the front, which it was sometimes. And there we have it. Yeah, it's quite a kit, is that? There's quite a lot to it. You know, the other sort of Lotus kits of this era, they're all very similar. They've got the same engine, and you know, they're much. This is unique though, because it's got all this additional aerodynamic primary chassis. Even I'm doing it here. The primary chassis, the aerodynamic bit that springs up and down, is almost like a second car. So it's quite a complex concept. And there we have it. So that's the Ebbro Lotus 88 Type B, the one that was supposed to race at the British Grand Prix but never got the chance, sadly. Hope it wasn't too long. I hope you found this interesting. I would urge you to look up some amazing... There's a whole tale around this. I'm surprised there weren't more documentaries about it. Don't believe people and some of the stuff I've seen recently that's all revising history about it wasn't very good anyway, it was never going to win and blah blah blah. Really? You think so? If they're not kept messing about with the rules, if the rules had been in 1981 the same as in 1980, this thing would have probably dominated Formula 1. Given a few months of development, it was good. They knew what they were doing. I know they went astray with the Lotus 80, but that was just taking it to extreme lengths. This is the one they realised was more compact. It was a simpler concept, and it had some adjustability built into it. The other one didn't have. And given time, it was going to be great. Nigel Mansell was incredibly enthusiastic about this car and was heartbroken when they wouldn't let him race it. And whilst yes, they did have some issues when they were the few laps they got in before they were stopped. That's true of any new racing car, you know. That's true with Mansell's FW14 Williams, and been true with just about everything. If you look at the history of the recent turbo hybrid era, I mean, for 6 months those cars are breaking down right, left and centre, and in testing hardly any of them could complete more than a handful of laps before they broke, so nothing unusual there. It was a new technology, and it was a very interesting time in Formula 1. I'm glad I lived through it and sort of witnessed it. It was weekly, there was new and interesting developments. And of course what actually happened when this car was outlawed is that Brabham, to sort of finish the story about how it matured, Brabham cheated their way around the rules, and I think this really was cheating. They had a pneumatic system with a lever that enabled them to literally drop the car with these ceramic rubbing skirts that were on the side of the car. They still had to have the 6 centimetre gap. They went out on the circuit, Nelson Piquet and Hector Rebarque, his teammate, would drop this lever and it would sink onto the track, bang, full ground effect. And it did this famously for the first time when they developed it. And it was Gordon Murray again, the genius that Brabham employed under Bernie Eccleston. And it was in the Argentine Grand Prix at Buenos Aires, and he basically went out and just dominated this race, and they were lapping people. I think he lapped the Renaults, which were the turbo cars, and instantly everybody knew what was going on. And they said that they had this. They noticed this tank. He put a tank near the back, and they said it was a ballast tank. And everybody thought this was what ran the system, and it wasn't. It was a much simpler idea actually. He came up with a solution that was a bit naughty, but it worked, and then everybody just copied it. And even Williams had this same system at the British Grand Prix. By the time Lotus were having their problems with this car, they'd all adopted this rather a silly system, because it meant that the cars were all coming in the pits being checked and being legal. Out on the track they were sitting right down with virtually no suspension, This was designed to give the driver, Mansell and De Angelis, a nice smooth ride with plenty of movement, and it let the chassis, the separate chassis, do the bit on the ground and do its aerodynamic thing. But the driver almost had the idea was he would have like a limousine, in racing terms, ride and not have this problem where massive cornering forces and hitting the bumps and getting problems with their backs, G-forces on their necks and all these other problems that spiraled from that. But sadly that was the way that it went, and of course in the end what was ruled to get around the problem long term, they came up with the idea of this wooden plank down the centre of the car, which has now endured until today, and they check the plank isn't worn more than 1 millimetre or 2 as a confirmation of ride height, and that's the way that the ground effects are restricted. But of course Adrian Newey developed his system of having a lot of rake in the car at the back, creating like a diffuse effect, nothing like as effective as these or the ones you've seen, but it got a little bit of that back, a little bit of it. And of course all the cars now, if you look, they have this massive rake where they look like dragsters that sort of sit up at the back. I don't like it, I think they're horrible. I think this was a much more elegant solution for Formula 1. And it would have meant that, you know, I mean, you look at how beautiful it is. It hasn't got any silly wings and lumps and bumps all over it. It's just a graceful looking racing car. Something's been lost, hasn't it, really? This is the golden era, like I said before. Anyway, I don't want to go on any longer. I hope you enjoyed the video and found it interesting. I would urge you to read more about this, about Chapman and his Lotus 88, and about the 1981 Formula 1 season, which was one of the most memorable for all these technical developments. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please, if you did, give us a thumbs up. I do like to do these sort of more historic ones with a model. I'll be making this in hopefully the next 6 months. Certainly by the end of the year I'll try and get this done because it's the anniversary year. And stay tuned, because you might see me doing some build work on it or a photo montage or something. And we'll try and get that done before the year's up. Thanks for watching. Really appreciate your company. If you enjoyed the show, please give us a thumbs up. And if you think you might find it interesting in the future, please subscribe, and if you've already done that, please ding that notification bell to make sure that you get alerted to any up and coming videos. In the meantime, until next time, thanks for your company, take care of yourselves, and bye for now.